Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, a fantastically enjoyable historical adventure, A Dark and Subtle Light by Mark Hodder. So this book comes out next week on the 8th of October, and I definitely recommend it if you are someone who enjoys kind of page-turning adventure stories. It's a historical adventure, but it's got a fantastical element to it as well. And I just had a really good time with it. It was a book that had me grinning from ear to ear as I was reading it. Mark Hodder is an interesting character. So this is the first book I've read by him. I have also got his first book, The Strange Affair of Spring-Heeled Jack, which I'm hoping to read soon. Both this book and A Dark and Subtle Light are set in the 19th century. And Mark Hodder, is one of the things that's interesting about him is he's also currently writing a series of stories about the character Sexton Blake. So Sexton Blake was a British kind of detective spy type character who was created in the Victorian era, but has persisted since then. So there have been countless novels, radio shows, TV shows, movies featuring Sexton Blake. And Mark Hodder is currently writing, like the latest adventures of Sexton Blake. I have one of those books as well, digitally, so I'm looking forward to reading that one soon too. So let me tell you then about A Dark and Subtle Light and tell you why I enjoyed it so much. And I think the thing that kind of encapsulates my feelings about it is that this is a book that in many ways feels familiar. A lot of the influences of the book are clear. It's definitely influenced by that kind of pulpy adventure story, and also I think by the kind of fantasy sci-fi wave of books during the 60s and 70s. And yet Mark Hodder manages to combine all of those things into something that feels fresh and original. So let me tell you firstly what it's about. So it is, as I said, a historical adventure story. It's set in the 1800s and it features a group of adventurers going up against a gang of fascists who have set up a commune. What's interesting about the story, though, is the fact that it weaves in real historical figures to it. So Machiavelli is the leader of the team of adventurers, and Leonardo da Vinci also plays a role. So you may have figured out already that Machiavelli and da Vinci were not around in the 1800s. In this book, they are immortals. So there is an alien species that is interfering with human affairs, and both Machiavelli and Leonardo da Vinci have become these immortal characters who can die and then come back to life again to kind of serve the forces of good when needed. On the forces of evil, you've got this group of fascists who again are being influenced by aliens. Friedrich Nietzsche is also a character in the book, so his writings have influenced the guy who has set up this commune. And it turns out that elements of this are based on truth. So in the afterword, Mark Hodder talks about the fact that the commune in the book was inspired by a real fascist commune in Europe in the 1800s. So what you have is Machiavelli and this team of adventurers infiltrating the commune to try and bring it down. And Machiavelli, interestingly, actually takes a bit of a back seat. So whilst he is the leader of the team, he's not really the central character. What you get to see is much more about some of the other people in the team, including a female warrior who is absolutely fantastic and has some brilliant fight scenes in the book. And that team dynamic is really interesting. It's not something you see that much in modern fiction. So when I think of teams in kind of a modern adventure fiction, I tend to think of like Marvel superheroes, so like the X-Men or the Avengers. You do also get team up sometimes in like cop series, so you quite often get groups of detectives working together, but it's not something you see so much in adventure fiction anymore. It used to be a really, really common thing, and you think back to particularly the post-war period when a lot of adventure fiction was about kind of military groups and things like that. Nowadays it feels like most of the heroes in thrillers are kind of standalone one-man armies, so it was really refreshing and interesting to read a kind of team story again, and I enjoyed that part of it very much. And in terms of like influences, this definitely feels like it may have been influenced by something like the Doc Savage story. So Doc Savage again, the leader of a team, and all of those team members have different attributes. That's very much the case in A Dark and Subtle Light as well. So that part of it I enjoyed enormously. There's also, as I've said, some fantastic action. There's quite a lot of humour in the book as well. And whilst you are rooting for the heroes, I found myself rooting against the villains even more. So the villains in this piece, the fascist group, are so utterly despicable that I really wanted to see them get their comeuppance. And there's also some very weird kind of science fantasy elements to the book. So there's a chapter early on where Machiavelli and Da Vinci go to this kind of other dimension, which was very weird but very, very enjoyable, and definitely felt like it was influenced by some of the kind of science fantasy works of the 60s and 70s. So as I said earlier, this definitely feels like a book that's familiar in some ways. It definitely wears its influences on its sleeve. But Mark Hodder manages to combine all of those things into a whole that feels very, very fresh. It's a really fun book. It's a kind of gleeful adventure story. There's something endlessly satisfying about watching the bad guys get their comeuppance. And I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed it. So I hope you found that interesting. If you enjoy this kind of pulpy adventure story, I think you'll have a great time with A Dark and Subtle Light. Anyway, I will leave it there and say, as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.